All right, hello and welcome to this Ask the Author webinar hosted by the International Transport Forum at the OECD. The ITF's Ask the Author series presents quickfire 30-minute snapshots of recent research on transport issues in a format that allows you, as the listeners, to pose questions to our authors. More on that in just a moment. Today's Ask the Author is on road pricing, and specifically the link between road pricing and decarbonisation. As many of you are no doubt aware, governments have traditionally used a range of policies and measures to charge users for their use of our roads. The most prominent of these measures traditionally has been fuel taxes, and it's this measure that provided the impetus for the report that we'll be discussing today. Now, fuel taxes levied at the petrol bowser have long been a significant source of revenues for governments. But as the number of electric vehicles increases, the share of road users not paying fuel taxes also rises. And this presents significant challenges. Some of those challenges are legal, some of them are technical, and some of them are political. We'll be discussing all of those today. Here to present the main findings and recommendations for the report is Rex Deighton-Smith. And Rex was the organizer of a recent roundtable on the decarbonisation and the pricing of road transport. Rex will give us a 10-minute presentation on the report, after which we will take questions from you as the listeners. Now, you're all able to pose questions for Rex using our Q&A function. You can feel free to pose your question now, and we will get to it in good time. You can see the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens, and we'll also be sharing some links in the chat to the report itself and to other resources. For now, I'll hand over to Rex, and we'll be back with some questions shortly.
Thanks, David, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for tuning into today's webinar. This morning, I'd like to briefly introduce the recently published ITF roundtable on decarbonisation and the pricing of road transport. As David said, the impetus for this roundtable has come from the fact that governments are increasingly aware that their fuel tax revenue base is eroding rapidly. In fact, this revenue base has been in decline for a number of decades. For example, in the European context, fuel tax has gone from accounting from 10% of total tax revenue in 1995 to less than half of that 25 years later. The two factors that have caused this decline are sustained increases in the fuel economy performance of new vehicles and a static, or in some cases declining, real tax rate for fuel taxes. Now, the decline that we've been seeing in fuel tax revenue is expected now to accelerate, and that's primarily due to government's policy responses to the climate crisis. For example, in Europe, we see a ban has been put in place that will take effect from 2035 on the sale of all internal combustion engine vehicles, and this initiative is likely to spread to other countries beyond Europe. We're seeing EVs, regardless of regulatory action, increasingly competitive in the market and likely to take greater market share progressively as a result. And we're also seeing governments rapidly adopting stricter emissions regulations, which themselves will tend to accelerate that improvement in fuel economy performance. The result of all of these trends is that rapid change is expected in the size of the fuel tax revenue. A recent report from a parliamentary committee in the United Kingdom estimated that current fuel tax revenues will fall by a third just by the end of the current decade, by 2030, and that by 2050 revenues will be 90% lower than their current level. If we were to try to replace that lost revenue with general tax increases, we would face significant difficulties. The same parliamentary committee report estimated that if an increase in the general consumption tax were used, an increase of 4% in the overall rate would be required to offset the loss of fuel tax revenue by 2050. Similarly, if we were to use the income tax system, a 5% increase in the general rate would be required. Now, neither of these things are likely to be very politically acceptable, and this raises the question as to what options exist that are likely to be more acceptable and that will contribute to achieving government's major policy objectives, and in particular, the need to move in a timely way to establish a sustainable transport system. The case for taxing road use and vehicles rests on two main pillars. The first one is about economic efficiency. There are some significant gains to be made from making drivers take account of the costs that their road use imposes on others. These costs are climate, other air and noise pollution, congestion, and crashes. This is particularly important for EVs. While they impose lower costs on people other than their drivers, they are currently completely untaxed. This means that the marginal cost, the cost per kilometre of using an EV is particularly low at present, and we would expect that EVs will be more intensively used if that remains the situation. That in turn means that the decarbonisation benefit of electrification will be largely offset, and that we will have significant increases in congestion in our cities. There's also an equity benefit of moving to tax road use. The general principle here is that all road users should contribute to the cost of the infrastructure that they use. Not only should all pay, but they should pay in proportion to the amount of their road use. And a distance-based charge meets both of those criteria for a good tax. Conversely, taxes on specific goods or services, such as road use, are not optimal for general revenue-raising purposes. Governments should stick to general consumption taxes for that purpose. We're already seeing replacements for fuel tax emerging. One of those is vehicle ownership tax surcharges for EVs and some fuel-efficient vehicles, which have been widely adopted in the United States. And these are typically designed to generate similar levels of revenue to the lost fuel tax revenue. We're also seeing simple distance-based charges being adopted in some jurisdictions. They're currently in place in New Zealand, in parts of the US, and in parts of Australia. Again, these charges have broadly been designed to be revenue neutral in most cases, although in some cases they are actually revenue negative, and this is justified on the basis that EVs impose lower external costs than traditional vehicles, as I've said. Congestion charging isn't yet widely used, but there's a group of about 8 cities, mostly in Europe, that have significant experience with congestion charging at present. That experience shows that congestion charges are successful both in reducing congestion and in raising significant amounts of revenue. And these revenues are increasingly being used to support expansion in the public transport system. Now, whenever significant new taxes are proposed, we need to take account of acceptability issues. Acceptability problems for new taxes arise in part due to lack of trust in institutions, and in part due to a tendency toward a status quo bias among populations. There are some particular factors in the road use sector, which include the fact that a significant proportion of the population spends a substantial amount on fuel, and that fuel prices are volatile and subject to rapid shifts. So we need to think about the design and the presentation of new taxes and do so in ways that favours their acceptability. One general principle is to try to identify and address any gaps between perceptions of the impacts of new taxes and their actual impacts. And secondly, to address the fairness issues associated with taxes, as research shows us that perceived fairness is a significant factor in the acceptability of a tax. For distance-based charges, we can improve equity performance and thus acceptability by applying lower rates or providing free kilometre allowances for non-urban dwellers. As well as applying providing an equity gain, this is also consistent with notions of efficiency, because the external costs of using vehicles are generally lower in non-metropolitan contexts. Acceptability could also be improved by adopting an opt-in approach, as has been done in the US. In the jurisdictions that have them, the vehicle registration surcharges can generally be avoided by opting in to the simple distance-based charge. Now, congestion charges have historically faced large acceptability issues, but there are several things that can be done to address acceptability. Firstly, we should note that the simple coordinate area charges that have generally been adopted are quite transparent in their impact, and this itself is a benefit for transparency. Cities are finding that if they spend the revenue from congestion charges on public and active transport developments, this provides options for users and improves acceptability. It seems that if we apply a lower charge over a larger part of the urban area, that's a more acceptable approach than applying a larger charge that is restricted to the very dense urban core. We can look at addressing equity concerns by capping the daily charges that are payable by residents of the congestion charging area. And we can try to present these charges in a positive light as being sustainable mobility or decongestion charges. Research also shows us that if we introduce congestion charges as part of a broader transport policy reform package, we get greater acceptability. And finally, it's also been found that acceptability generally increases over time as people become more familiar with the congestion charging system and better able to adjust their activities to take account of this new environment. We need to consider balancing the different policy objectives that we're pursuing. Some have argued for a revenue neutral approach to reform to be adopted to aid acceptability. But as I've said earlier, we need to increase the overall level of taxation of road transport on efficiency grounds. This implies retaining fuel taxes for conventional vehicles. Higher taxes on these vehicles are needed because they impose higher external costs. Timing is important. If we act before EVs are more widespread in the vehicle fleet, we're likely to encounter less resistance to reform. Finally, governments need to think in terms of implementing supporting policy reforms. And a key area for consideration here is that as EVs have become more competitive in the market on their own terms, there's a need to shift subsidies from government away from EV purchase and toward harder to decarbonise areas such as buses and trucks, and potentially toward ensuring an adequate development of the charging infrastructure. As I've said, combining simple distance-based charges and congestion charges can improve efficiency, maintain and even increase revenue, and thus help to finance the move to a sustainable transport system. However, moving to a more differentiated distance-based charge can achieve important additional benefits. This is because many of those external costs that I've highlighted vary widely in their size, but with time and place, and some also vary with the weight and power of the vehicles using the road. So a differentiated distance charge should vary charges according to all of those dimensions. This, however, has to be a medium to long-term objective, as there are some key impediments, both technical, legal, and indeed political, that need to be addressed before this can be done successfully. So finally, to the recommendations of the Roundtable report. Firstly, that governments should reform fuel taxes so that they account for the full climate and other external air pollution costs of motoring. That they should supplement these fuel taxes with distance-based charges to ensure that EV drivers contribute to infrastructure costs and to assure that incentives for their overuse are avoided. They should introduce congestion charges where these are needed and consider earmarking the revenue from those charges for the development of public and active transport. The level of road user charges generally need to be set at levels that will help meet our sustainable transport objectives. We need to make introducing differentiated distance-based charges a priority in the medium term, and we need to reform incentives for the uptake of EVs to better align with our broader policy goals. Thanks for your attention today. As David indicated, the report is now available for free download from the ITF website, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Rex. And there's a lot to absorb there. And I can see that we already have a number of questions in the Q&A. So I think without further ado, we will just go straight to those questions. And just a reminder that if you have a question, please use the Q&A function. Our first question is from Ella, and Ella asks, to what extent are the opt-in systems in the US used?
It is very early days with most of these replacements for fuel tax revenue. However, it appears that a very large proportion of drivers are opting into the distance-based charge rather than paying the surcharges. It seems that one reason for that is that most jurisdictions who've adopted this approach have capped the amount that can be paid under the distance-based charge, so that users are unable to pay more if they opt for the distance-based charge than they would in any case pay under the vehicle registration surcharge. So it appears that that's been done in part in order to encourage people to go down this path and to establish those distance-based charging systems and allow people to familiarise themselves with them over time.
Thanks, Rex. Our next question is from Yessa, and Yessa asks, does the literature suggest how long drivers need to adapt their behaviour? And I'm assuming this is in the context of adapting their behaviour to the kinds of restrictions that are imposed by various kinds of road pricing.
Yeah. Some of the congestion charging literature suggests that the level of support gradually increases over several years, and it would appear that that pattern is in part a product of the fact that it does take that amount of time for people to fully adjust their behaviour. What the literature tells us is that people are really not very well able to predict ex ante how they would respond in terms of changes to their travel patterns to the imposition of a congestion charge. But that in fact there's a very wide range of compensating behaviours that are ultimately taken, and that therefore the impact on people's lives of the congestion charge is generally less severe than is feared will be the case before the event.
Thank you very much, Rex. Our next question is from Tordur. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Apologies if not. Tordur asks about the introduction of a new distance-based taxes, and asks, what is the appropriate time scope for introducing, educating and communicating this new system to the general public? And also asks, has the ITF designed a PR roadmap for implementing distance-based charging?
To answer the second part first, no, we haven't so far, although it's not a bad suggestion, I might say. I think that the amount of time required to implement a distance-based charging system very much depends on what kind of system we're trying to introduce. What we have seen is that in the jurisdictions that have gone down this path, that is to say, some of the Australian and US states, they've been able to move quite quickly. So that in my home jurisdiction of Victoria, the time lag between announcement of the policy and its implementation was, I believe, less than a year. They were able to do this quickly because it is a very simple policy. It is aligned with the annual vehicle re-registration system. People take a photograph of their odometer and upload it through the Registration Authority's website. They receive an invoice based on the difference in number of kilometres noted on the odometer reading this year versus last year. So it's quite a simple system. It's quite easy to understand, and being calibrated to actually raise slightly less revenue in the Victorian case than the fuel tax that it replaces, the size of the charges for most people is not especially large. There was an initial pushback, quite strong pushback against this charge on the basis that it was discouraging EV uptake and against the direction of broader government policy in that regard. And that seemed to have a lot to do with the fact that there weren't a lot of policy incentives, positive policy incentives in place in Victoria. More broadly speaking, we're seeing governments, on the one hand, positively encouraging EVs with subsidies and other incentives, but adopting these charges on the other hand as if you like, balancing policies. So quite quickly, where we're talking about a simple charge, but as I indicated, the technical, the political, the legal impediments to be overcome before you can adopt a more sophisticated, varied charging system are significant, and I think it will be several years at least before anyone's in a position to do that.
Okay, thanks, Rex. A question here from Andreas. Have you considered the impact of different fuel taxes and road pricing in the EU in the context of tank tourism, or whether that has an impact on the choice of route that a road user will take? I think the approach in that respect being taken to distance charging is evolving at the moment. As I've mentioned, it's a fairly simple distance-based charging system that is in place in the jurisdictions that currently have them. What that means in practice is that even though it's a state government that is levying the charge on you, they're levying that charge in respect of all distance you drive, regardless of whether it's within their jurisdiction or outside it. That, I guess, is an inevitable outcome of the basis for levying the charge. Some jurisdictions have suggested that in the future, when more sophisticated charging systems are adopted, there may be a change there to only levying the charge within their own jurisdiction. At that point, what's been called tank tourism, or behavioural distortions due to differences in the charges, I guess, could arise. But at present, the way these charges are structured, it's not an issue because you're charged a single rate regardless of where you travel. Okay, thanks, Rex. Bessie asks or states that the academic and grey literature have not conclusively shown that the external costs of battery electric vehicles are significantly lower than internal combustion engine vehicles, and that some studies show that BEVs actually have higher external costs. Do you have a view on that? Has the ITF looked into this?
Look, I think the case for road user charging stands regardless of your view on that particular issue, because at the moment EVs are not being taxed at all. I would say that it's pretty clear that in most circumstances EVs are superior in terms of their climate performance. The extent to which they're superior varies according to a number of factors. Probably the most important is how green the electricity system is that's used to charge them. And so we would expect significant change over the next decade or two as we green our electricity systems, which will mean that gap, that gain that we make from moving to electric vehicles will increase progressively over time.
Thanks, Rex. A question here from Caroline. How about developing countries where electrification has very different dynamics and different kinds of tax enforcement issues? Has the ITF looked at this question of road pricing from the point of view of those developing countries?
We have the first thing to say is that while fuels tax revenue is generally quite important in OECD countries, it tends to be more important still as a proportion of total revenue for a lot of developing countries. So that means that the size of the issue, will ultimately be larger for those countries because they stand to lose more revenue in relative terms than developed countries. Conversely, of course, we would expect the timeline will be a longer one for electric cars. But that said, what we're seeing is that the rate at which electrification is progressing for 2- and 3-wheeled vehicles, so for your simpler and cheaper vehicles, is actually much more rapid than it is for electric cars per se, and certainly for heavy vehicles. Given that those smaller, cheaper 2- and 3-wheeled vehicles constitute a much larger proportion of the overall vehicle fleet, then what we're likely to see is pretty rapid electrification in that sector. And so even though the adoption of electric cars may lag behind, this issue about changes in fuel tax revenue will come about because a high proportion of vehicle kilometres in a lot of those countries are undertaken by 2- and 3-wheelers.
Thanks, Rex. We've got a number of questions here and 5 minutes or 4 minutes to go, so we'll see how many we can get through. Hilia asks, to what extent did your study assess the impact of road pricing in urban areas? And what were the findings in terms of allowing localities to reinvest in their local mobility and public transport networks?
I would say that the focus in terms of that use of the revenue was more closely on the congestion charging side of things in the roundtable discussions, and that it was certainly a significant issue that if those who were paying the charge could themselves see the benefits that were obtained, then acceptability was much greater. The benefits on the one hand that they see are lower levels of congestion, but that's not enough in itself to offset the cost that they bear. So seeing alternatives in terms of improved infrastructure for public and active transport is a significant element of that acceptability equation. And it's important that those who are paying are those who are benefiting from the point of view of that acceptability equation. So yes, keeping it local in terms of the expenditure is actually an important factor.
Thank you, Rex. Just before we go on to our next question, we have a very simple poll that we will be asking all attendees. If you could take 1 minute to fill this poll out, that will give us some handy metrics in terms of your enjoyment of this session. Evelyn asks a very interesting question here. What pricing models can be used to work out the pricing levels that can meet sustainable transport objectives while at the same time ensuring fairness?
As I was saying during the presentation, I think there is a need to recognise that certain parts of the population have a relatively high level of dependence on private vehicles and a need to use them fairly intensively. And of course, those that live in relatively rural and remote areas are the most obvious group there. But there are also those who have requirements to cover substantial distances for professional purposes. So making sure that those groups are not unreasonably disadvantaged is an important sort of part of the puzzle in terms of successfully implementing these policies. And things like having a differentiated per kilometre rate for metropolitan and non-metropolitan dwellers is one means of doing this, or as I suggest, an allowance of a certain amount of free kilometres that can be covered before the charges kick in. So I guess the other side of the equation is that of the recycling of the revenue, where it goes. So to the extent that there are groups that potentially are disadvantaged by the way the charging system works, if revenue can be recycled back to them in some format, that's another possible policy option.
Okay, thank you, Rex. We have a number of questions here that I'm sorry we won't be able to get to, but perhaps I can just read them out here, and then you can provide us with a final thought, Rex. An anonymous attendee asked about redistributive mechanisms that might already be in place in some countries. For example, a number of free vehicle kilometres or a lump sum payment. Yessa asks a follow-up question about do we see any kind of rebound effects? What perhaps where perhaps a distance cost is seen as a moral license to emit? That's a very interesting question. Anu, excuse me if that's the wrong pronunciation, but talks about the fact that the ultimate goal of congestion taxes is to reduce congestion and move individual users to other modes. This will in time reduce the revenue generated by these taxes and drive authorities to increase these taxes to maintain the previous revenue levels. This could in turn undermine the support base for these taxes. How do you propose to deal with that dilemma? Perhaps we could finish with that question, Rex, because it's a complex one, but it goes to the heart of what the report is talking about.
Yeah, no, that is a good question. And I think one large-scale dynamic to point to there is that a lot of research is showing us that if we move toward a more sustainable transport system, the overall level of investment in transport that will be required is lower than if we stick with current sorts of transport models. This, in part, is because when we say what is the total need for transport investment, it's public but also private investment. So as people move from buying assets that are generally underutilized, the car that sits in the garage for 90% of the time, to buying services, in a more shared multimodal mobility model, we see a reduction in the level of investment required. So for governments, that dynamic is to some degree undercut because the need for investment will ultimately be reduced by the reshaping of the transport system.
Thank you very much, Rex. That's all we have time for today, but just very quickly, Brendan has asked a very final question regarding Caroline's question and asks about, or makes a comment here about Africa's the vehicle fleet in Africa. Brendan, without going into details, I'd point you to the ITF Transport Outlook, which has a very short section that covers this issue and is going to be the focus of some upcoming research by the ITF. So please stay tuned for that. Thank you very much, Rex, for taking the time to take us through this report. I would encourage all of you to download and read the report and to sign up for our publication updates, to follow us on social media and so on. But that's all we have time for today. Until next time, it's goodbye for now.